Item 8L is an item that's been before council, been discussed for quite some time, and we have several options for the council to consider.
Mayor, could I frame the issue if you don't mind? Back in August probably of 2009, as we were putting together the MAPS 3 program, we had the 8 programs pretty well outlined, and we were going toward a little over $700 million program, 7 years. And such. And as we were finalizing the program, some things came to attention. One of the things that we talked about at that point in time was that one of the more thought to be preferred sites for the convention center would have been on the site where the OG&E substation was. And to move that substation and move the lines associated with it was thought to be about $30 million at that time. And so we added $30 million for that. At the same time, Councilman White, Councilman Bowman asked that we take a look at some potential money for a hub station and to also take a look at some matching funds for potential commuter rail at that time or some light rail. And so $10 million was added into the budget for the modern streetcar. At the same time, we got the report back from Hargraves, who's doing the consultant on the park, and we had $120 million in the park, and we thought 130 would probably be a safer number, so we increased the park's number from 120 million to 130 million. We can only do sales tax in 3-month periods. And so we rounded up at that point in time to 7 years, 9 months, and that gave us the $17 million contingency that was in there. There wasn't a $17 million contingency at that point. So that was the package that was put together and put out to the voters. It was voted on in December that year and passed. Some of the campaign materials did say $280 million for the convention center. They combined that. When we started the process out after that, we've had several presentations at councils, and we've broken that $30 million out or asterisked it as a subcategory under the convention center of that $30 million for infrastructure. In some places, I think primarily we showed it as a $280 million total budget with an asterisk that shows this $30 million for infrastructure. This kind of been a side note. And that's been in presentations at council that Mike Mize has made here several times. It was shown that way when we had the workshop with the MAPS 3 board back in April or whenever that was, May, whenever that was. It was shown that way when we brought it forth when we worked on the calendar a few months. And so that's been pretty consistently shown that way as 280 but $30 million out there. And then we cited the substation or the convention center, and of course that is not the desired location or the recommended location to be where the substation is. Some people believe it would still be beneficial to move it. It'd benefit the park. There's some discussion about that whole issue. I thought our critical issue with MAPS 3 was going to be the timing. And so we had a schedule that we discussed and went through the MAPS process. And that came to council and was voted on in July, and it was a split vote. And we decided whether we were moving what projects up and not, and moving that. We had a big discussion at that point in time. After that, I thought we'd bring back an implementation schedule that would simply memorialize that time schedule. I was wrong, because as we went through the process and brought that implementation schedule plan back to the MAPS 3 process, the Convention Center Subcommittee, chaired by Tom McDaniels, who's with us here today, said, you know, as we're going forward, we really need to memorialize and get that $30 million into our total budget and make it $280. And through the subcommittee, and I know some of the councilmen were there that day, they moved and to let's modify the budget and put that in as a one number in there of $280 million. Now, with the plan that Mike Mize had put together, or ADG, at the time, the staff had been working with, we just kind of always shown that as an asterisk, it's clearly an asterisk, and it says infrastructure $30 million on the side. It went to the MAPS 3 full committee, and the same thing. And not only is Tom McDaniels here, who's not only chairman of the subcommittee, chairman of the MAPS 3 committee, and I see Mike Adams is here today, who's also on the subcommittee, and they came forth and said, yes, let's put that 30 in with the convention center to make it a $280 million project. And so we brought that recommendation forth, and we brought back forth the recommendation that was originally put out, where we keep it in that subcategory of $30 million for infrastructure. And then I've talked to enough council to know that there was not consensus on this item. And so we put on a compromise item that would put 15 into the park and 15 into the sub-convention, just for a compromise type situation. Now let's go back to OG&E for a second, because if it is chosen, if that's our desire not to move that substation, some have talked, can we screen it? And yes, we can, and we've talked to OG&E, and we believe that to putting up a screen, and that hasn't been totally defined, but a example of that could be a concrete wall that looks like stacked stone, similar to what's on the bridge that we talked about this morning where the canal comes under the I-40. I think most of you have seen that, where you can stain the brick a different color. It's not a bad-looking appearance. We think for $300,000-$400,000, somewhere along that lines, we can probably have a pretty nice screen that would cover most of the substation. Now, there are some electrical lines that go through the park and adjacent to the park. There's a line that goes east and west down 4th or 5th Street, 4th Street, that goes across there. And then there's a line, and these are major transmission lines, that goes on the east side of Robinson, not in the park, but on the east side of Robinson until you get to the very south end, and then it kind of kitty corners across the park. And if we were to take care of those lines, because the other lines, the minor lines in the park, those will all go away. But these are our big transmission lines. If we were to move those, the total cost of getting rid of that major line going east and west and the line not in the park along Robinson that cuts across, the total cost of that we think is right around $5 million. But I don't believe that's all a MAPS 3 cost. And we haven't negotiated that, but I think under the franchise agreement, part of that cost should be borne by OG&E. And we don't have that all worked out, and that would be a negotiation through OG&E. But the total cost, we believe, is slightly over $5 million if you wanted to screen the substation, take out that east-west line, and take out that Robinson line. And that's a point of discussion, because is that necessary to take out that line? It's not in the park. It's across the street from the park. And again, that's a policy issue to come forward. So with that background, that's why we're here today. After I thought we had it all worked out, we were just going to memorialize the implementation or the schedule that we had, from 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago. We're back to decide what to do with this $30 million. And I know I've talked to, I think, all the council or most of the council about this. I know there's not consensus necessarily on this issue. And I'm here to tell you that we're looking for direction today. And I think any decision you make would be a good decision to help us move forward. And I think we can get by. It's a question of the size of the convention center. Does it need to be 250 or 280? Well, you're talking about some square footage. It's going to, the larger it is, you'll be able to host maybe an extra convention or two because of having a larger. 250 was the original number that was thought to be needed at the start of the process. And so with that, we have Mike Mize here with ADG, and he's going to go through a presentation on the implementation schedule.
Mr. Mayor, council members, Mr. Couch, thanks for being here. I'm glad you recognize that Mr. McDaniel and Mr. Adams are here as well. The presentation that we're going to make today is really the culmination of about 8 months' worth of work and the input from an awful lot of people, from the Citizens Advisory Committee to the subcommittees to many citizens who've attended these meetings, a number of different consultants that have engaged both by ADG and by the city to help in this process. Some of the information that I'm going to show you up front you've seen before. We're doing this as part of a review, but it's a review of the entire and a summary of the entire plan, which you've received as part of your packet for the meeting today. Once again, the plan includes not just the implementation, the program order, which you have previously approved. It includes conceptual scopes of work, and it includes budgets. And this has been presented to the Citizens Advisory Committee as well. There have been some edits since the last Citizens Advisory Board meeting, but these are edits which were recommended either by subcommittees or by the Citizens Advisory Board itself. This is a very brief summary of what those edits include. It's been reformatted. We've tried to make it a little bit easier to read with larger fonts. We've removed proper names from some of the facilities, such as the ballpark and the convention center, since Those have changed in the past, and we want this to be a document that can stand for a long time. We've added paddling to the Oklahoma River to demonstrate the fact that that is more than a rowing venue. We've added, and at the request of both the Convention Center Subcommittee and the Advisory Board, we've added some language from the CSNL executive summary that was prepared for the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber with respect to the actual Convention Center piece. The implementation plan includes the project timeline, which has, as I said before, been approved by City Council previously. Once again, on the budgets include consulting, architectural and engineering fees, environmental investigations, geotechnical and construction testing, land acquisition where appropriate. Each project has its own project contingency in addition to the $17 million overall program contingency, which Mr. Couch referred to earlier. Once we allocated those costs, the balance became the cost available for construction. And once again, the construction budgets, which had previously been published and made known, we have deemed as midpoint budgets. So those budgets, if it was $130 million, it is $130 million as of January 1st, 2016. If work occurs, any kind of work occurs on that project prior to January 1st of 2016, those budget amounts are diminished by 3% per year to reflect the cost of inflation. If it's after January 1st of 2016, they're increased by 3% to allow for the cost of inflation. The reason for doing this was to try to allow parity for projects that came early in the project and projects that come later in the project so that they have the same relative amount of budget available to them for construction. The next set of slides is project specific, and we're going to start in the same order that we've gone from the very beginning of any presentation that we've made. The Convention Center is the first budget. As Mr. Couch pointed out, there are three versions of the Convention Center budget. Version A is effectively a $280 million midpoint budget. It includes the $30 million for a total of $280 million. The construction for, actually design for the Convention Center would start sometime in 2012, and construct, actually it starts in 2014. Construction would actually start in 2016. Version B is a $250 million Convention Center budget, with the $30 million being added to as an infrastructure contingency, and you'll see that slide at the end of the presentation. Everything else would stay the same in terms of the timing of the project, but because this is a $250 million project, obviously the size of the facility would be reduced proportionately based on the reduced available construction cost. Version C is the compromise version that Mr. Couch referred to. It has a $265 million Convention Center budget, and $15 million then gets added to the Parks budget, which would increase their budget from $130 million to $145 million. Once again, the size of the Convention Center would be between both the A and the B components. The overall size of, do this off the top of my head, the $280 million Convention Center budget would allow for approximately 530,000 overall square feet of Convention Center. Version C, the $265 million, would allow for 500,000, and version B, the $250 million, would allow for approximately 470,000 overall square feet. Because the park is impacted by version C, we've shown versions A and B together. This is the original $130 million park budget. Work on the park would be divided into 3 design and construction phases. A very early phase, which would have a minimal amount of money, approximately $11 million, that would be dedicated to finding a way to land the pedestrian bridge on the south end of the upper park and to try and provide some landscaping on the far north end of the upper park. That would take place fairly quickly. The completion of the upper park would take place at around the midpoint of the program, and the completion of the lower park toward the very end of the 10-year program. Version C is the version that would add $15 million to the park budget. Timing would stay approximately the same. For purposes of this version, we've added that $15 million to the first design and construction phase, which would take place very early in the program, but that is something that still could be open for discussion and consideration. Modern streetcar and transit has not changed really from the last time we presented any kind of a budget to you or to the advisory committee. That budget still is $130 million midpoint budget. Construction on the streetcar is phased in a number of different ways and includes some procurement phases whereby we would go out and try to purchase rail and perhaps cars earlier in the program, partly because it can take rail is sometimes a 1-year lead item. Cars can be as much as 2 to 2.5 years. So procurement of that equipment and those rails would happen long before construction. We've just to let you know what some of the progress has been with respect to our involvement on the streetcar and the subcommittee's involvement. We've had some significant meetings with Rick Kane and COTPA and with COTPA's consultant Jacobs. We were concerned that our schedule tracks with the schedule that COTPA has with respect to trying to obtain federal money. We are now very convinced that the schedule that we've provided in the program order, in the project timeline, which you approved, tracks very well with the schedule that COTPA is currently on in trying to obtain federal financing. We have told the subcommittee that we're going to continue to monitor the progress that COTPA makes so that we can make sure that if we need to make adjustments to the schedule for MAPS 3, we can advise the advisory board and council of those changes so that we can make sure that we take advantage of all the federal funding that may be available. Oklahoma River. You're probably aware that this budget hasn't changed. It's still a $60 million midpoint budget. We are in the process right now of, we have a consultant on board who is working to provide working drawings for the river lighting for the last 1,000 yards of the race course. The consultant is nearly completed with their work. Once they've completed that work, that project will go out to bid, and we'll keep you advised about progress on that. We've also engaged city's also engaged a consultant to look at a feasibility study for windscreens for that same second 1,000-yard course, and they are in the process of putting together their first presentation and recommendation to the city. The river projects will be done in 4 phases. The lighting and the windscreens, the first phase. a number of other projects, all of which are listed in your on your implementation plan, would be the second phase. The whitewater facility would be the third phase, and the balance of the project in phase 4 would utilize whatever funds would be available at the end of the project for the additional landscaping and other components of the river and river improvements. Fairgrounds. Budget remains the same, $60 million midpoint budget. Work on the fairgrounds would be in 2 phases. First phase, which would happen fairly early in the project, would be parking and site improvements. That will happen fairly quickly. We have not yet engaged a consultant, but that's something that will happen, I believe, before the end of the year. We'll solicit for a consultant to provide work for the parking and site improvements. We've worked with Tim O'Toole and the parks people, the fairground people, to make sure that happens in a way that works with the events that always take place at the fairgrounds.
Mike, may I ask a quick question about that? The
Sure.
Fairgrounds has a very, very detailed master plan, long-term master plan that a lot of this was built around. Do we need to add an additional consultant to your mind to review that work, or could we not kind of mirror what they've already designed? That's a great question. We're using the Fairgrounds master plan as kind of a guide. The consultant that we would engage for the site improvements and for the parking would be to actually design construction drawings to go out to bid. Okay.
Next, the senior health and wellness centers. Once again, we're estimating that there can be 4 health and wellness centers. There is a total of $50 million, which that budget has not changed. For the health and wellness centers, we think that there will be 4. The city has engaged and is about to receive a final report from AIP and KMD with respect to components of the health and wellness centers that may be common to a number of them. We still recognize that each of these health and wellness centers, depending on where it's located, depending on the community it's going to serve, may be different. But there will be some common elements, and part of the reason for the AIP and KMD study is to identify what those are. So the subcommittee is working on that. We also know that the partners, the operating partners for these projects, are going to be very important, and there is actually a draft RFP for those partners, which has been submitted to the subcommittee and which we hope to finalize next month, to allow us to go out and solicit for partners, and at the same time we will be going out to solicit for architectural and engineering services for that first center, which will be constructed very early in the program. Trails, the trails budget of $50 million midpoint budget has not changed. We have an RFQ out right now for a consultant to design the first phase of the trails. We expect that to happen very early in the program, and the first phase would probably be a trail that would go from Overholser to connect to the Oklahoma River Trail at its west end. Oops. Sidewalks, once again, that budget has not changed. There is an RFQ out right now for architectural and actually engineering services to work on and I'm going to use the phrase master plan to help determine where the initial sidewalks are going to go. As part of the implementation plan, we understand that there needs to be a lot of involvement on the part of the Sidewalks and Trails Committee, on the part of council, and other people to determine exactly where they're going to go. But that engineer will assist in that process along with ADG and the MAPS staff. But the idea is to get sidewalks under construction as soon as possible. Contingency, program contingency, excuse me, versions A and C show a $17 million contingency, which is the original contingency that Mr. Couch spoke about earlier. Version B of the contingency has $30 million for an infrastructure contingency in addition to the $17 million overall program contingency. That's a lot of information to go over very quickly. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Mayor, I have a question about the on the rail on page 11. The $10 million that was put into that budget for the hub. I don't. There's the $10 million's in there, but I don't see a designation that leads me to the
hub. It is a specific line item in here, and I know this is really hard to read, but what is it 9.25 because it takes place early in the project, so it has been deflated, if you will, by 3% a year to reflect the fact that those dollars may be spent very early in the program. So there is a specific line item to reflect that.
In a more detailed budget than the one that you have here.
It is on there, isn't it?
What? I believe it is. Show it to me.
Okay, it is. If you look at Transit Phase 1 has several subheaders.
I found it.
And so it is there. Thank you.
It's there. Okay. I just didn't see where it was.
There's, like I said, it's a lot of information in a short time.
All right. Any comments or questions for Mike before we discuss the issue? Yeah, David.
Thank you, Your Honor. In looking at, and I think the question really to us concerns the $30 million, I was trying to identify any written documents that was presented to the voters prior to the election that broke down the $777 million, the total program, by project. And the only thing I could find was on the website how it broke down the cost by projects. Do you or Mr. McDaniels or Mr. Adams, do you know of a document that shows how the projects were broken down by cost at the time the information was presented to the voters?
The instructions that we were given when we started were to use $250 million for the convention center. We've been consistent with that since December of last year. I'm not sure. I am not familiar with all of the documents.
Yeah, Mike was not even hired during the campaign. It was a year afterwards.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any, Eric?
I'm only aware of one document. It's a yellow and white flyer that's on the city's website that was a part of the pre-campaign materials. I'm not aware of any other documents that were released from the city other than just that one.
Well, could you tell me how much was set aside or identified for the convention center in that document?
So in that document, it prescribed $280.
That's what I've seen. So I just wanted to clarify what was presented to the voters as far as the amount for each project.
I think the one thing I'd like to add with that is obviously each of the projects, as you get into the details though, I mean, those were just single figures that were assigned to each of the projects. There's several components individually underneath the 8 major projects as we talk about different wellness centers and different phases and things, but obviously none of those details were provided early in the process. Those are what are coming out to us today.
I understand. I'm just making a point that I think it's important that if we presented something to the voters that we should follow through with that.
Eric.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Yeah, let's skip and then Pete.
Okay, excuse me.
With that, there was a location that was pretty much for all practical purposes, identified as the location site for the convention center. And wasn't the substation, wasn't it part of the issue of the $30 million that was necessary for the removal of that?
You know, it's my understanding that the answer is yes, that the original $30 million was budgeted for the substation relocation costs. But as for the actual location of the convention center, I think that we had always envisioned that there was going to be a study determine best location. That just was one of those options.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eric.
That's what he said what I was going to say.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for either of these two?
Just a brief comment. On any of the construction projects you've ever been associated with, has anybody at the end of the day said, hell, we made it too big? I've done several projects. I've never heard that comment, that at the end of the day, we should have made it smaller. It's always been just the opposite. We should have made it bigger. And I think that's an important point to consider as we go forward. This is not going to be a repetitive process. Every year we can stretch it a little bit. We need to make it as big as we can initially and go forward.
Mayor?
Yes.
I agree with Pat. I just don't think we ought to make a decision on the front end that we only make one project larger. The same that argument holds true for every project on the list. And as a result, I'm going to move the B. I'm going to move version B with an amendment. And I have an amendment prepared, and I'm going to pass it out.
Okay.
Your Honor, before we get into the motion phase, could we have a little bit more general discussion?
Sure. Certainly.
On the various options? I feel that the information we gave the voters was a $280 million convention center project. There was no project in there that listed $30 million discretionary fund for the city council to spend however we wanted. I think we only have two honorable choices, that is to spend it on the convention center or give it back to the voters. We end MAPS 3 months early, and they get their $30 million back because we didn't need it for the convention center as we intended. To spend it on other projects, to me, is disingenuous, and it chips away at the public's trust in our city council.
Meg?
Well, I think I respectfully disagree with that, Councilman. I think we have a very valid option to consider putting it in a contingency right now, given that I don't think we have all the facts available. My recollection is that we very clearly specified $250 million for the convention center, and that was in lots of conversation with the chamber and the other parties that were involved in helping us frame some of these projects, and that the $30 million was clearly identified as being required to move the substation. The voters voted for the total package of $777 million, and we have a firm obligation to meet all of the standards and the projects that we submitted to the voters. But I just don't feel at this moment in time that we have enough information in front of us to decide how those dollars should be spent. They very well may need to be spent on the convention center. We may discover things in the course of developing that site that require that some of that money go there. But we don't know that yet. And as I've been thinking about this, I think a little bit about our personal budgets. If somebody, were to hand you an extra $10,000 in your annual budget, you certainly would find a way to spend it very, very quickly. And we don't know what that need is yet. And that I believe that we have some very specific things that need to be done with regard to the transmission lines that will affect the park. I believe that there's some wonderful options available to potentially wrap that substation, whether it's using decorative stone, as the city manager recommended. I've actually, a couple of years ago, approached both OG&E and Hans Butzer, who's a local architect, for some ideas of things that have been done internationally. And there are ways to wrap substations with netting and LED lights that turn them into pieces of artwork. We might be able to do something iconic that we could use around the city. So I find myself today in a position of simply feeling like I don't have enough information to make the best decision for all of the projects involved, and think from a fiduciary responsibility and for the trust of the citizens that we ought to place that money in contingency until we have more information.
Okay.
But it was not presented to the voters as a contingency fund. If we don't relocate the substation, and that was clearly what it was intended to be, your asterisk. I'm always suspicious of asterisks because the print gets very small. But the $30 million was set out for a specific purpose, relocate the substation. If we don't have to relocate the substation for the convention center, we either spend it on the convention center or we give it back to the voters. I don't think we have the right to hold it back, so if we have an overrun in streetcars or the river, we spend it someplace else. I mean, I think that $30 million was intended to be associated with the convention center. Now, it was intended to be a specific site, I'll agree with that. But once we decided we were going to move that site, move the site of the convention center, we had no need to relocate the substation. That money ought to go to the convention center or we ought to give it back to the voters by ending maps 3 months early. I realize that may take a vote of the people to do that, but we've got lots of elections between now and the time that we have to make that decision.
Okay. David?
I would agree with Pat that if we don't use it for the 280, if that truly was, and I'm still not convinced, but that's all the information I've seen, that $280 million was the figure given to the public prior to the election, that we need to honor that statement or terminate the sales tax early enough to where we can refund or, not take in the $30 million. At this point, I don't see a need to relocate the substation. I was over there this weekend, took plenty of pictures, and I'd be happy to share them with you all. I see the problem, 2 main power lines going east to west, and if they could either be placed underground or somehow relocated, I think that's the only issue with respect to that substation, in my opinion. For example, Early Wine Park, which I use, many of our friends use all the time, has power lines running along May Avenue on the side of the park. Now, this is on the east side of Robinson, not along the side of the park as far as the transmission lines. And Early Wine also has power lines on the north side of the park along the line where the houses are adjacent to it, as well along 119th Street on the south side. Nobody has ever talked to me and said, boy, I wish we could take these power lines down. They just have become, not noticeable. It's kind of like when we were in high school, if we had a blemish developed on our face, to us it's a big deal, but to everyone else it's probably not that noticeable. I think it's the same thing right now. We're focusing way too much on this substation, and I think with just a little bit of effort we can conceal it to the point to where people don't even recognize the fact that we have a substation there or that it's a problem. So if we're going to pull away $30 million from this project as it was presented to the public, then I agree with Pat. We ought to return the money and terminate the sales tax early enough to where we would only collect $747 million instead of $777 million. Thank you.
Over here, Larry.
I realize everybody has their own personal perspective on this, and I'm going to share mine. When the MAPS 3 proposals were developed and when the material was presented and we were either in favor of it or not in favor of it as a council, I happened to be in favor of it. I went out on a number of occasions and gave talks on the importance of MAPS 3 and how it was needed. I gave talks on the importance of all projects within there. Although I happen to have a favorite project, my favorite project happens to be the White River rafting portion of it, but the convention center was a part of it. I wholly endorsed it, and I told people that the amount of money that would be budgeted for that project was $280 million, and I believe I'm personally committed to support whatever effort comes up to make sure that the $280 million is allocated to the convention center. If the decision is made not to, then I concur that we should just give the other $30 million back. But personally for me, I have to support the $280 million because that's what I said to the voters, and I want my trust to be kept intact. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Yeah, Ed?
There's a couple of things that we can learn contrasting this with the original maps. And from that experience, we had an entire mayor's election basically decided between Guy Liebman and Kirk Humphreys over shortfalls on the arena, with Guy Liebman wanting to indefinitely delay the arena. I think this has come up over and over. I think the fiscally conservative option is to keep money back and look for the unknowns, as Meg was saying. You're going to have environmental abatement issues, water table issues that are just not known at this time. And so learning from previous experiences, I think the fiscally conservative approach is to wait and see what unknowns come. I think the other lesson is that clearly this log rolling, this lumping 8 different projects together is inferior to the way we did it originally, and having specific line items for the taxpayer so they know exactly what they're getting and we don't have this kind of confusion later. I think the idea that somehow the $280 million was presented to the voter and that's some kind of bond with the voter is a little bit disingenuous, and I think the reason is that, number one, there were other things promised. We promised 57 miles of trails, for example, and we're only going to deliver 32 miles now. We had pictures of the convention center on the Court Shore South Park, and so if we're just looking at literature, I think that that would be problematic. Any Google Earth search of that site would show as a large substation on Southwest 4th and Robinson. I think this also goes to the issue, and we've talked about it in previous meetings, that we had 2 studies that we relied on for this. Convention Center is more than a third of MAPS 3, and we relied on 2 different studies that were not commissioned by the city and were not available to the voters. And that presents a problem when we're talking about a bond with the voters. We had the Convention Sports and Leisure study, which was, to this day, has been withheld from the public, has not been released to the public. We had the HOK study, which used $250 million as the amount that we needed for. I mean, that's $250 million wasn't pulled out of a hat. We had a study, the HOK study, that said $250 million. That's where that number came from. So if that had been released to the public, I think that this would be less confusing today. The site locations issue in the HOK study would have been vetted. The elephant in the room of this, we have this other issue of a convention center hotel, which the Convention Sports and Leisure study, which if it had been released to the public, would have let the public know the convention center is not viable, or at least according to this study, without a hotel, and the public's going to have to come up with an additional $50 million for a hotel. The public did not know that at the time they voted on MAPS 3. They didn't know about the substation or the convention center hotel. And both of those should have been vetted. I do take, in August of 2009, OG&E made a presentation on what the substation relocation would cost. It wasn't $30 million. It was between a low of $70 million and a high of $100 million. That's available to anyone through an open records request. It's freely available, and some journalists have it. But that's what 4 months before the election was the bid from OG&E. It was somewhere between 70 and 100 million for relocating the substation. If the public was aware of that, I think we would have had a thorough vetting over the ensuing 4 months. Now, subsequently, the city intensely negotiated with OG&E, and that number plummeted. But in August of 2009, the number was not 30 million. I think that if it was not the convention center, if you had some other, say that you needed a $130 million maintenance facility for it to be viable, and the public was going to have to come up with $50 million, I think we'd be talking about, I don't think that would fly. Finally, I would say if it's in contingency, that would give us, I mean, we're talking about the voters and the taxpayers and what they want. Let's ask them. I mean, I know, let's do polling. I mean, I know that that's not the way you run a government. This is a representative democracy. You can't do it on every issue, but let's ask them what they want. Let's poll 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 voters and ask them, now that we have this 25 million, what do you think we should do with it? Now, if the polling numbers come back 55-45 or even 60-40, that would be one thing. But let's say the numbers come back 80-20 or 90-10. I think it would be hard to ignore that kind of large feeling among the public and the taxpayer. If we're concerned about a bond with the taxpayer, let's ask them. Right now, let's do polling. The Convention Center polled at 27% approval before MAPS 3, as low as 8% in wards like Ward 3, with 92% disapproval. So that's before the public knew about the substation. That's before the public knew that they were going to have to come up with an additional $50 million for a hotel. Let's ask them now that they know those two additional things where they would allocate the money. Thank you.
All right. Pete? Well, I'm not sure. Some of the things that these other ideas of what we could do are all interesting. I don't think we can do any of them today, though. I think the only way to preserve our ability to be that flexible is to place the money in contingency. And that's the substance of my motion. It places the money in contingent, leaves all these options, Councilman Shadid's option, Councilman Ryan's option, all those options are still left open to us. We haven't spent the money, we haven't done anything. The only thing that is to be done with the contingency money is this resolution asks that we immediately undertake to develop an innovative plan to minimize the adverse impact of the substation and the power lines on the park. That's it. That's all it asks for. It doesn't ask for the spending of the money, just to come up with some innovative ideas about what we can do. And I would renew my motion to adopt B, subject to the resolution that each of you have been handed.
Okay, Gary? I don't know where to start. Being the council representative on the MAPS Advisory Board has put me in all the meetings of all these projects. And believe me, I've heard every version of every project. I'm sure Jim Couch kept looking at me as he was going through his explanation, because I don't think, when he says he didn't know it was going to come this way or this quick, he's probably blaming me for that, because I sit in the Convention Center subcommittee when they were debating this issue. And when I asked my opinion, what I told them was that if they felt that that was part of their budget, they simply needed to move that on as a recommendation to the advisory board, and that the advisory board would take that on, and then they would vote it yes or no that it's part of the convention center budget, and they'd move it on to council. I said, you got to get this in front of the policymakers. I knew the $30 million issue was not going to go away just by deferring this longer and longer and longer. And I said, you know, Lord knows that committee had enough bullseyes on it anyway, targets, that it didn't need anymore. It simply needed to make its recommendation and move it on and let this policy-making board decide what they wanted to do with it. So that's why you're dealing with it today in the format that it's in. I'm going to support option A, but I want to talk a little bit about why first. I don't know of any projects that I've ever seen done by the city that had a budgeted amount put into it that covered everything. It covered land purchase, covered utility relocations, it covered, you know, whatever it might be. We think there's an oil well underneath there we're going to have to move, whatever it may be. And then before you ever got to the point where you started doing drawings and you found out one of those things wasn't needed, that you jerk money out of the budget without ever finishing that project to see if you did need it. That's why I think it's important to keep this in there. Who knows whether the site selected for the convention center doesn't need $30 million for whatever they're going to find underneath the ground. We don't know that. You're right. We don't have enough information. But I don't know of any other time that we've jerked a budget out. Let me give you a couple of examples. You mentioned transit. $10 million was put in there at the last minute, just like the $30 million was, for the hub. We now have a consultant saying they don't think it's going to take $10 million. It's going to take $6 million. The Transit Committee spent a lot of time in their last meeting discussing, hoping that the council would not take the money away from them and leave it in the transit budget because they don't know what it's going to be, what it might be needed for. So if you do this to the convention center subcommittee, are you going to pull $4 million out of the transit? Because they only need $6 million for the hub now. That's what the consultant has said, whatever that may be. The senior centers. There's been some discussion by some of the proposed, or the people that might be interested in partnering with us, that they might be willing to donate land that they have already, or that might be in conjunction with property they have or whatever. So are you going to pull money out of the senior centers now when you think you might not need it and move it over? I don't think so. You're going to leave it in there. Now, having said all that, I'm going to tell you that however this vote goes today, I'm going to smile when I walk out of here, and because we're going to build these projects, and we're going to build them the best way we can, and they're going to be great projects. All of them are. But the thing that concerns me about the pulling of this out of the convention center now, I understand the concept of pulling it out, putting a contingency, and if we need it later, it might be available, might not, who knows. But the problem I have with pulling it out now is we've already, the project has already been lowered from what the original concept of why we needed a new convention center and what it was going to be. When you look at the amenities and you look at the square footage and you looked at the reasoning for why we needed a new convention center, if you pull the $30 million out and the architect and the engineers can still look at the scope of the project and the amenities and not say, yeah, but we're dealing with this amount versus this amount, then I'm okay with letting them design and bring it back to us and see what it is. And if we need more money, pull it out of contingency and do it, whatever. But sitting on the Convention and Visitors Commission, I can tell you that the need for a new convention center is not wholly about just needing a new convention center. It's not just about getting new conventions. It's about the fact that our current convention center will continue to lose even the ones that we can host now because we don't have things like ceiling height, we don't have the new technology that everybody needs. If we don't keep up in the market for what you need as a convention center, using that scope, that study that was done to give us what we want in a new convention center, if we tell them you don't have as much money, so you're just designed to what dollar amount sitting in the budget, then I don't think we're going to reach that concept of what the scope was in the convention center when we talked about what it would take to not only get new ones, but to keep the ones that we have. So I'm a little concerned that the scope will not be designed as such. But I'll go back and say again, having said all of that, I don't know that any of these are killers. They're certainly not going to provide death to anybody. But I just find it strange that we want to pick and choose when we use the arguments of contingency, leave it in the budget, we might need it for that particular project later on. And I do have a little bit of sense of the fact that all of the documents when we were going around talking about MAPS 3 said $280 million for the convention center. And yes, the substation, I'll wholeheartedly agree, was put in at the last, $30 million was put in at the last minute for the OG&E substation. But to me, that wasn't any difference than saying, oh my God, we think there might be an oil well underneath it, so we need to add that. And then later on we found out, well, there really wasn't one, so we don't need the money for it. Are you going to pull it back out? To me, it's the same concept. And I don't know that we've done that with any projects, certainly none that I remember aware of in my years with the city. So.
Your Honor.
All right. Yeah, Pat?
Just a quick comment on contingency funds. I'd like to reiterate a point that was made earlier. Each of these projects in and of itself contains contingency money, including the park. And I'm not sure what the total is, but I would guess around $5 million contingencies for the park project. In addition to that, there's a $17 million infrastructure contingency fund available to help with those sort of things. So we've got contingency money here before we do anything with the $30 million. It's not like we had a bare bones budget with no contingency dollars set aside for it. each of the budgets that were developed, yes, included contingency money. And so how much contingency money do you need? They made an estimate of what was a reasonable number for contingencies, and it's in there. $17 million set aside separately as contingency money, and we didn't have any contingency money, as I recall, in MAPS 1.
That's right.
And so I think we're in a good shape as far as contingency without looking at this $30 million.
Okay. Any other comments, Meg?
Well, I just might add to that as I've wrestled with making this decision and trying to decide what I think is the most prudent financial decision for the city, I've drawn a lot on our experience with the Sports Facilities Oversight Trust. And that's an example. I think the citizens remember that was a very unusual situation. We voted to extend that penny sales tax for a very short period of time, just that 15 months. And practically the day we voted was the day we went into a recession. And where we thought we were going to collect $120 million to complete the 2 projects, at the end of the day we collected about 108. That required that we go back and re-engineer the entire project. It's cost us more than a year delay in time to get the projects built. And although they will be built to a very high quality standard, we had to reach very deeply into contingencies and other things to make sure that happened. And we're now looking at a 7-year and 9-month project, $777 million. We happen to be in an enviable economic climate right at this minute, and sales tax collections are strong. But we have no way to know over the course of this next cycle. I think what we do know is that we're going to go through some ups and downs. And to preserve the funds that were set aside for a reason that we don't need right now, to me, seems like it makes the most sense. And Gary, I thought your discussion was great. I felt like you defined exactly the definition of contingency and why we have it and why we need it. And I guess my last point would be that the study that was done and was referenced when we decided on the options for the convention center, because we were presented with 2 options, if I recall correctly, a smaller footprint and then a much larger footprint, one of which was $250 million and one of which was maybe as much as $475 million. And we opted to go with the smaller version to start with the opportunity to expand in the future if we needed to. But that number that was suggested by the consultants was $250 million. It was not $280 million.
Okay. I think Fanny is here to speak. She has signed up. Fanny, you want to take the microphone? Is there anyone else here in the room that would like to speak? Okay, we have several people. All right. Fanny, why don't you lead us off? I'll ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes or less, and we'll need your name and address for the record.
My name is Fanny Bates. My address is 1116 Northwest 27th Street. The people of Oklahoma City never wanted a convention center. This bill, MAPS 3, was specifically designed to give us things that they knew we wanted and trick us into voting for a convention center that we didn't want. What we wanted, one of the things that we wanted, and one of the things you could give us out of this is at least some rail. We have a line that the city owns from 10th Street, from Douglas High School to the zoo, which could be made operable for about $500,000. And it could be running on weekends and early in the morning and late at night and getting people to the zoo and back. New rail costs 1/10 of what new highways cost. 1/10. We also have a line that goes to Tinker Air Force Base. You could put some of that money into, I'm talking about rehabilitating these lines. You can rehabilitate those 2 lines, and that would be something that's real, that's a part of our history and part of our future, something we would be proud of, because it's representative of who we really are. And I want to thank Tom Elmore for giving me information on that, because he has an encyclopedic knowledge of rail in Oklahoma, probably more than anybody else in the state. And we all have talked about that Oklahoma City is the tornado capital of the world. Cities all over the United States give people a list of shelters they can go to in case of a tornado. Oklahoma City doesn't do that. Oklahoma City doesn't do anything but scrape up our bodies after a tornado kills us. Some of this money could be used to beef up buildings we already have to make them shelters and then mark them as shelters. It wouldn't cost that much. Find buildings, there are abandoned buildings that have good shelters underneath them that have full-size basements that could be turned into a shelter for a small amount of money and marked, and people could be given a list of those.
Fanny, could you wrap up your comments?
At Wildwood community, that's a predominantly black community, and they are not allowed to go to that shelter there. The shelter is saved for the white people that work at the zoo, the predominantly white people that work at the zoo. Those people at Wildwood have lived in that community for 30 or 40 years, and they're told they cannot go to the shelter in their own community, even though they've been paying taxes for decades and decades.
Fanny, I'm being reminded that you've got to stay on topic here for what we're discussing today.
This is the topic.
Well,
the topic is that...
Fanny, we have opportunities at the end of the meeting for general comments to council.
These are not general comments. This is talking about what we want. This money should be spent on what we want and not on what the Humphreys want.
I'll give you another 15 seconds if you'd like to finish up. All right. Anyone else has signed up to speak on this item?
Yes, I think some ladies want to talk about sidewalk and trails.
All right. Katie LaHue.
Hello.
Katie, I will need your name and address for the record.
Oh, Katie LaHue, 515 Northwest.
And I'm somewhat. Are you here to speak on the item that we're discussing, or were you?
Yes.
It says here item 12, and we're on item 8. So is that just a miscommunication on your sheet?
I didn't write number 12 on there.
Yeah, it says item 12, which would be items from council, which is more for general comments from citizens.
Oh, okay, I can wait.
Well, you don't need to wait if you're talking about the item that we're discussing, about the $30 million and the convention center budget and those types of issues. Is that what you wanted to speak on?
More so towards like the running trails.
Okay, well, then why don't you wait till the end of the meeting,
Okay.
and we'll give you a chance to talk there. And it looks as if the other two people that have come are in similar mode. They've also signed up for item 12. All right, is there anyone here wishing to speak on their item that we're considering? Yeah, Joshua, come on up.
All right. In just similarity to what the previous person said, when I was here a few months ago, I was under the impression that the voters did not support the convention center like the other MAPS projects, and that this wouldn't pass a referendum if it were put to the vote. And again, also that after it was put to a vote, what I saw the process going on as was just that the convention center pushed these studies to really get all the funding directed from the projects that the public did support, transit and healthcare, and which arguably would be better at job creation and serving the public interest, and really just picked all the funding for itself. And we pushed this through without really having it examined, and the public never really saw it. And that it's not so much about what the funding is for the, it's not so much about changing the funding, because we can always spend another $30 million on it if we need it as far as the convention center, but it was the timeline that was actually changed, and that we bumped it up at the expense of the other projects. And again, that was a timeline that was never presented to the voters. We changed that last minute. And then David Orr recently said in the Gazette, "It's hard not to see this whole sordid affair as a cynical textbook case of bundling and bait and switch. Package the expensive, unpopular project with ones people are enthusiastic about, all within an inferred timeline, then do the bidding of the ruling class in town once you get the vote." We were also told a month or so ago that this could be deferred, the vote, and then when 2 members were gone, it was put to the vote, and everything's being pushed through so fast. I mean, why do we need to push it through so fast? This timeline is just getting changed. Again, the voters support the transit. They support the health care. I don't see the support for the convention center.
All right. Thanks, Joshua. Appreciate it. Anyone else here wishing to speak on this item? All right, more comments from council? I'm assuming you've had 5 minutes to think more about it and have new things to offer. I'm wrong. All right. We're looking for a second then on Pete's motion. Who made the second? Okay. Meg made the second on the motion. We have a motion and a second. Any more comments or questions before we vote? Yeah, Gary?
Excuse me, to move item L2 with the attached resolution that I sent you.
So it's version B as amended.
Yeah, version B as amended, excuse me.
Your Honor, Pete, may I ask you to just quickly explain your amendment? The $30 million, instead of going towards infrastructure, would be dedicated solely to a contingency fund. Is that correct?
Moves the $30 million that was designed to move the substation into contingency to be earmarked for infrastructure needs.
In the park.
I'm sorry.
Same thing, yes.
Doesn't your amendment restrict it to the park use?
No.
It instructs the subcommittees involved and the advisory board to begin negotiations and fact-seeking on addressing the OG&E power line issue. With the money available, then the council would have the opportunity to address those needs once they determine what they are.
So it doesn't really have anything to do with the $30 million?
What's that?
It doesn't have anything to do with the $30 million then? If all it does is tell somebody to go out and do a design, the $30 million is not related to that project. So the amendment's interesting, but I don't think it really bears on what we're talking about.
Oh, it seems to me it gives direction to staff. It seems to me that it determines that the $30 million will go into the contingency fund, and that we are asking staff and the advisory board and the subcommittee that's involved to start the process of looking at what it would cost to wrap the substation and remove the lines that would affect the park.
But there's not we do that, and I think that's important. But we shouldn't tie it to the $30 million.
Well, I think we are tying it to the $30 million.
Yeah, I think we are too, and that's what concerns me a little bit.
Okay, well, I understand you may not be for this, but I think that's what it does.
They really relate. We can do this final resolve without having to talk about the $30 million at all. Because there is contingency money in the park fund, there's contingency money in the general fund, that if somebody decides that it's important to relocate transmission lines to shield the substation, then there's contingency money available to do that. We don't have to tap the $30 million.
I think if this motion fails, then we can entertain that idea. Okay. All right. Yeah, David?
Your Honor, I'm sorry. I don't mean to belabor the point, but I don't see where it says that $30 million will be placed in a contingency fund.
It's just version B. It's version B of the resolution, version B, which basically would put the $30 million in an infrastructure budget.
He's taking version B and modifying it, saying it's going in contingency, but it specifically says that the MAPS 3 Citizens Advisory and the Park Subcommittee should develop an innovative plan to minimize the impacts of the substation and the overhead power lines on the development and the use of the MAPS 3 park.
Your Honor, question.
Yeah,
Am I the only one? I just received this a few minutes ago. Did anybody get this before the meeting? This is all brand new, and I'm not in a position to even assimilate it right now. I think the honorable thing to do, quite frankly, is to vote on option A, and if that fails, then consider this at a later time. But I think if I understand it correct, option A, Jim, was the recommendation that the Citizens Advisory Committee recommended upon the recommendation of the subcommittee?
Yes, sir.
And I think we should vote on that first.
Okay.
There's already a motion.
I've already recognized the motion in the second to vote on item B. I understand your point.
It was made and seconded. I think we've got to dispose of it before we can do something else.
All right, we're voting on 8L2, version B,
as
amended. Ready to go? All right, cast your votes. The item fails 4-5. Oh, sorry. Okay, the item passes 5-4. So.